Episode 19, The Past. Varder stood over the corpse of Matias pent. Volentia sneered down at him.
"You've broken my little lord, dog."
Varder looked at the dead lord. He grimaced. A whelp of little note, a weak man from a weak land. This lord could not do what he could for his mistress. But Volentia was furious. An evil glint shined in her eyes as they stared down on Varder from her hands. Malicious fury was in her voice.
"Bring me your mate, dog."
"Yes, mistress." Images of his mistress flowed through his mind. Of the day she took her lands from her elder sister. Of what she had done to her fellow human. The pains she went through to take her adversary apart, piece by piece, while she still lived. The skin was peeled slowly off the flesh. With utmost care, Volentia took the veins out of the muscle, then the bone. She did so from the fingers and toes inward. By the end, one could see every heartbeat as it pulsed through the veins. The screaming went on for months. Even the wounds that the woman inflicted on herself were undone. The tapestry of the true human was a thing of horrible beauty. Strung up on spikes, the woman lived for 9 days. The slight to Volentia had been a minor insult. The higher mistresses celebrated. To them, it was a work of art. Varder now saw, in his memory, not the visage of his first deceased mistress, but his mate, his lovely Talindra. The dog was a pretty young thing, far younger than he, but a spirit and a joy was in her. Varder loved her. He approached her now. Talindra was a tall, willowy thing, with bright red hair. She sat with her thick leatherworking needle as she used it to fix up a pair of rough, broad boots. Varder came behind her, and with the barest flick of his shoulder, separated her head from her shoulders. The body crumpled instantly. Varder slung his axe back over his shoulder, then bent to lift the head by the hair in one hand, and the corpse with the other. Something simmered in his gut, but his mind was too shocked to accept it. Volentia purred at the sight of her thrice chained. Such creativity and foresight. If only his actions had sated her wrath. The anger roiled beneath her skin like worms.
"I'm pleased you have brought me your bitch, though in more pieces than I expected. Give her here."
She pointed at the ground, and the brute obeyed. Then Volentia punished him. Matias woke from a violent frenzy. The northern woman had her neck bitten clean through. He could taste her blood, so sweet, so savory. Not a drop was left in her. But it spilled from his chin and made a mess about the floor. The floor of pelts. He was in a crude tent of sorts. Wood and hide made the roof. He had been asleep on a wooden altar. He'd been dead. Hand to his forehead, he stumbled through the door flap. He pushed out into the middle of a Northman camp. It was dark. No sun and no moon blessed the sky. A few fires flickered against the dark around the outside of the camp. There was a surprising order to the place. Matias slipped out of the tent and made his way to the edge of the firelight. On his way, he picked up a spear. He could feel them, every beating heart in the camp. They helped him see. At the edge of the firelight, he threw the spear. It felt incredible. The guard at the fire died, choking on 2 feet of wood. This was the only fire where the guard that lurked in the dark was asleep. It was easy to tell the difference. Before he fled, he ate the flesh of the dead man. It did little to his hunger. Volentia wept. She hid, secluded in her tents, no sisters about her to share in her grief. Of course, she couldn't let the dogs know she was weak. They needed her to be strong, to lead them. But goddess, it was hard. She had never liked leading. Luckily, the thrice-chained was there. Without it, she would have long ago lost control of the little things. "Mistress," came in a little thing's voice. "Mistress, the corpse! The corpse is gone!" She burst from her tent, scowling.
What?
The little thing shrunk at her agitation, desperately sharing his news. "The Lord's corpse, it vanished! With it a chained and a bitra dead." Volentia looked down at the tiny thing. For a long moment, her confusion waned. Then she gasped and spoke quickly.
"Quickly now! My little lord lives! We must be after him!"
Through the woods and over hills and streams did Matias run. He fled from his defeat and death, from his gross murder of that Northman and woman. On his way he preyed on his people, and his guilt rose. He had one last hope, one last thing to gamble on. Castle Immortus loomed above the city. Townsfolk fled to the mines south of the river and swarmed towards southern lands in great droves. The streets were bare, the castle fortified. The last of Matias's knights stood with a few young men left to guard the lands of Tandem. Lesser lords had fled. In his absence, they had persecuted his generals and blamed them for his demise. When he had first arrived to the castle, the lords had called him an abomination, an impostor. He felt like one. But he had a duty he had to fulfill before his destruction. A flood of eyeless, naked men swarmed beyond the walls. Bone blades rose above their heads. Hundreds of ladders were brought to these creatures by chained. Atop their heads were grotesque horns, and their skulls formed massive, bony caps. Bones mutilated their flesh in growths from their joints. They howled as they charged in the dead of night. Matias's body was filled with unholy strength, and he launched his javelins into the creatures, felling one after another. Arrows and stones rained down on them from the walls. They surged over their dead, trampled the wounded, and brought their ladders to the walls. Beyond them, in the far distance, was their mistress, surrounded by torn flesh and mutilated, impossibly living forms. Regally did the demon sit amongst her fires as she watched her creatures bleed and die. She smiled. Bright white teeth glinted in the light she saw by. The sight of her drove her savages wild, and the feel of her presence drove her suitors, her demonic consorts, to their suicidal charge. Ladders thudded on the wall. Those that were near were tossed aside by 3 men working together. Matias immediately cried, "Retreat! The walls are too long to guard at any length." The men rushed through empty streets. Clutter and pre-made barricades were thrown behind them as they retreated. The suitors impaled themselves due to the weight of their number. Arrows and spears fell more and more as they ran and shot, ran in through. Matias took the rear guard, his movement unnatural. The castle loomed black into the moonless night. Torches were lit and thrown about the moat on both sides. The men flooded the walls and towers. A fire started in the southern third of the city. The suitors sought and butchered the few who remained there. The drawbridge raised as Matias finished crossing. He heard shouts and the thrum of bow and crossbow, the grinding of the drawbridge's chains, the unburnt screams of the half-demons beyond the moat. There, the assault ended that night. The men reported no corpses on the streets. Matias could feel it, the lives running amok in his city. Every heart in his walls beat in his ears. One was large and powerful. It drew him in. It called to him. So he took one of his family's famed iron spears and launched it with unholy strength. Fury fueled his every inch as the thing thundered from his grasp. He felt the heartbeat suddenly spike with a sick pleasure. It fled from his walls. Houses were torn down or used for cover as the Northmen heathens built bridges and brought their ladders to bear. The days Matias slept and the nights he rained chaos on their number. But soon he was out of the family spears. He considered the box in the armory. The ancient weapon lay below. It was cursed, but mighty with dark power. As he pondered the spear, horns bellowed. He hurried to the walls as he felt the hearts race, and presences move to the moat. Stones and torches were thrown down amongst the horde as they swarmed on dozens of crude bridges. One collapsed under the weight of a dozen suitors stomping across it. The berserkers hurried to the walls as they were slaughtered. Spears thrust down from between crenellations to stab again and again. Blood soaked the ladders and bodies toppled to the ground. Then one forced its way onto the wall. It was swiftly slain, but in its place was 3 more, and in a dozen other places the suitors gained footholds. Matias's blade rose and fell. Savage after savage died, bellowing in blood. The real men came, with shield and axe. They stuffed the walls. Matias's men started to die. Their screams haunted him as he pulled them deeper into the castle. The walls slowly fell under sheer weight of numbers. The Northmen climbed over corpses of suitors and chained alike to get at their enemies, all alight with bloodlust. The walls were coated with blood as they retreated to the central keep. He felt the demon approach. He stood on the keep's balcony. It smiled up at him.
"You have fought well, little lord."
He glared hatefully at it. The demon's smile slid into nervous concern.
"Little lord, my dear Matias, why do you look at me so? Has the goddess not given you dreams of our shared purpose, as she has given me?"
Matias looked at her in confusion. "You have seen to the slaughter of my people, to the death of my knights. You have pushed me to hide in my castle. What shared purpose could we possibly have?"
"Why would the death of little things bother you? No scout or envoy was accepted, all slain as they made contact. When I came forth, my chained did as they do. Do you hate me for my dogs that bark?"
He spat. "You unchained your dogs and they bit. You are my bane and death, creature of heretical gods. No matter the sweetness of your tongue nor honeyed words." The demon's face contorted in an unrecognizable expression. Then it turned to rage.
"You will rot in your own dungeons, little lord."
She stormed out of the courtyard. A ram was brought forth, and the Northmen aggressively broke the gates of the keep. Stones were thrown from the balcony and through murder holes. The Northmen shattered the gate, only to be met by the second and its portcullis. The corpses piled up, and the men fled. Ladders were brought. Hither came forth the demon on her long legs. She vaulted onto the balcony and let forth a torrent of blood. The men fell and died. The knights roared. A bloody whip came from the dead, and she set about herself. The whip tore through flesh and gambeson with ease. It tangled in knights' arms, and she tossed them over the walls, to be beaten to death by the chained. She moved with the sure grace of a dancer, and death was her partner. Deep into the bowels of the castle she chased. The portcullis raised, and the men swarmed into the keep. The few women who had stayed screamed. Matias turned to face the demon, only for his blade to be instantly tangled by the whip and torn from his grasp. He fled, and his knights died. Matias's failure was complete, and his doom certain. The demon kept its promise. Varder stood over the boy. Hands shook on a knife. Rage filled his eyes. Varder saw himself in them. Varder grunted and bashed the boy on the head. The boy stabbed. A small cut was made on Varder's hand, but the boy was sent to the floor. "Good little thing," he slurred. "Better than father. I like you, boy. What name?"
"Octavius,"
the freshly orphaned boy said. Varder grinned. The boy couldn't have been more than 5, yet surely an unmatched thrice chained awaited in his sinew. Matias hung from the chains of his dungeon. The smell of rot filled the air, and his flesh wasted on his thinning frame. Muddy eyes looked at the thing before him. A red blur stood there.
"Why don't you eat?"
it said in a woman's voice. "Blood," he whispered. "Feed me blood."
"Have it, my lord."
A hand gently brushed his face. A palm pressed into his mouth. He bit down greedily and was stunned by the loveliness of it. It was more filling and rejuvenating than any other blood. His vision cleared and his parched lips drooled. Truly a crimson wine with no comparison. His eyes found the woman, a bright red dress covering her lithe form, and her black hair fell long below her hips. She smiled sweetly. She was like one of his paintings come to life, only with a lot more clothing. "Who do I owe my life to?" he asked.
"Volentia."
He savored the name. A right proper noble's name. "Your house?"
"Destroyed by demons long ago."
"Then we share a fate. But tell me, what brings you here amongst the depth of our enemy?"
"The demonic mistress thinks I can barter with you to get her what she wants."
Matias winced. The woman was a slave. The reality of that was beyond grim. His respect for her grew, though. She was no broken woman. "And what is this thing it wants?"
"She wants you for some reason. Wants your heart and loyalty."
Matias snorted. "I shall die first. It paraded the corpse of my nephew around the dungeon some time ago." He snarled. "He was 6. The woman looked distraught. She put her hands to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes.
I'm sorry. A moment, please.
He waited, and when she was done, he asked, "And why does it think sending you to me would help her?" She blushed and looked away.
I'm supposed to be a gift.
Matias snorted. "For a monster who speaks Tendamin so fluently, that demon has no understanding of us or our culture." At this, she laughed. It was a human thing, a snorting, raucous laughter. Her obvious embarrassment at the snorting was equally endearing. Matias smiled, though the expression failed to reach his tired eyes. "You will have to forgive me, but I find the idea of any action I could take against you distasteful. Any act that the heathens believe I would savor would merely sicken me." She frowned.
Considering your paintings, I expected you to be more of an animal.
She looked away, her face flustered. Matias smiled sadly. "Dreams from better days."
They could be your dreams again.
The woman with the red dress would come and go. Each visit she was more beautiful. Her grace and shy demeanor captivated him. The demoness grew tired of him and left him to rot. He was drunk on love. His mind clouded. He ignored the things he shouldn't have. Volentia looked from her hands into the mirror. It was perfect. Her height, proportions, and face were the perfect disguise. She looked like a little one again, but with one glaring exception. She had no eyes. The skin was pulled over her empty sockets. She blinked and tried again. The eyes vanished from her hands and appeared on her face. They opened. She was disoriented for a moment as her brain adjusted to the improper placement of her eyes. Were they supposed to be brown or blue? The one blonde servant girl did have striking eyes. At least in the painting. She'd never met the woman. She wished she had met one of the women in Matias's paintings. Maybe then she would have always remembered the color of her eyes. Well, her eyes were red. But she couldn't use that in her disguise. She blinked. No, definitely brown, but what kind of brown? At the end of several hours, she was done. She looked longingly at some of the previous lady's dresses. Any would raise more suspicion than she was willing to risk. But this same old red dress tired her. Tired her till Matias's face brightened at the sight of her. His joy overflowed and filled her. She was mad. Definitely mad. That was the only explanation for how she felt. How she always felt guilty when she saw him. How she had to stop tormenting him, as it hurt her too much. It was impossible. He was nothing but a little lord, a thing to be played with. But he was her plaything.
It's time,
she said.
I have food under my dress and thick enough clothing for the fall.
The keys, he said hopefully.
Here,
she said triumphantly, holding them up. He marveled. Out of the cell, he kissed her for the first time. His arms held her with a desperate tightness, like he was worried she was just his imagination. For a moment, she felt a thrill she had been warned of. A forbidden spell. It would make him perfect like her. She craved such a thing. A lesser version was at her disposal with their embrace. It would be a simple matter to change him into a suitor. Her heart cried at the thought. Suitors lost themselves in lust for blood and women. It would destroy him. He unveiled to her the hidden passage in the dungeon, and they fled from the city. Through long, dark tunnels they ran. It was a few hours before they emerged on the far side of the river. There they kissed again, in the moment of freedom under the star-filled sky. She and he took and gave more than they had bargained for. As dusk graced the land with rosy clouds did Volentia wake. They were supposed to have fled to the local ministry citadel, but instead they had gotten carried away, spending the rest of the night here. She smiled and lifted the thick blanket they had used to defend him from the sun. He was so little and adorable. She carefully bent and kissed him. She was surprised that the horns didn't get in the way. Her slowly waking brain panicked. She shrunk herself, condensing her spines and horns back into her body. It was a painful process. She shifted the bones in her face slightly. Matias liked women's a little more fat in the cheeks than she had. Her hands hovered over her naked body, making sure nothing was out of place. Even though she had panicked, everything looked right. She closed her eyes. It was time for the hard part. Volentia, what's wrong? She turned her head about, eyes wide. Crimson irises glowed in the dim light of the stars. They stared into a matching set. Suddenly overwhelmed, she fled into the woods. She had shortened her legs, and he moved with an unnatural, disturbing grace. Over root and around branch they went, till Matias caught her, pinning her to a tree. Despite the chill night air and their shared nudity, neither felt the cold. He stared deep into her eyes. She wept. She collapsed into him. Matias grunted and was forced to slowly let Volentia down. "When did they do this to you?" he whispered.
"Years ago."
His face contorted, confused. "But why wouldn't they finish the process? I know you live. I could pick out your heart from 100. So you must be..." Then he realized. No. It can't be. He rolled away from her. "It's impossible. Your heartbeat. I can feel it all the time."
"I made a fake heart to replicate my true heart, and always ensured I had my disguise on at night."
You're the demon." It wasn't a question. Her sobs redoubled.
"I love you,"
she said, in desperate longing.
"I do, I swear on the goddess's name."
"You hunted down my nephew and my sister-in-law. You butchered my people from the mountains between our realms and into the mines south of the river." He sneered before his anger crumbled. You made me do horrible things. All this, and you think I can love you?" She whimpered and cowered before his words.
I wanted our child to be heir."
His heart shattered. Once by her treachery, and again by her torment, Matias looked down at Volentia. Knowing her truth, he was amazed. She was sincere in her suffering. For a demon to bow before a man was unheard of. His heart quavered. Uncertainty set him to trembling. "Let me see you." She looked up. Then, trembling, she stood, and as she rose, she changed. Her flesh expanded, horns spun from her hips, shoulders and head. Her head looked down and away at nothing, and her eyes shut tightly on her hands. Hate boiled in Matias's blood, but there was love there too, a love he now doubted. "Was everything a lie?" he whispered.
No, please."
She collapsed to the dirt, the weight of guilt being more than her heart could bear. Give me a night, snarled Matias.
I shall wait till my death.
Perhaps you will. The demon sat, curled in on herself. She waited, not noticing the sun or rain, ignoring the cold and heat. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and she fed on her own flesh. The pain of hunger was a distant hurt in her mind. The hole in her heart, the far more agonizing reality. Volentia shifted her head. Matias stood before her, staring, the starlight being just enough for her to see by. The moon grew and wilted. A full 7 days had passed. He tossed her a corpse. Eat with me. His voice was distant and disturbed. It was a little thing. Eating little things was kind of gross, like eating a dog or cat you had once loved. Or a monkey. It wasn't technically wrong. They weren't human, after all.
I will partake in what remains.
He knelt, taking the flesh and tearing a limb free for her. She ate it hesitantly, watching his crimson eyes as he looked at her horns, face to face, but never eye to eye. A sob broke from her then. It was over. It had to be. Can you show me? He asked.
Show you what?
My Volentia? She did. She did, but with the wrong eyes. Crimson eyes locked with crimson eyes. One pair a lie, the other willingly deceived. When they were finished, Matias took her hands. I have a plan, he said. Northmen and the blacks and reds of Immortus killed the suitors, and the beasts seemed not to care. They fought them with such fervor that the city lay ruined. The people bought the lie. A few innocent disappearing before their time was of little note. 9 months later. There was a terrible cry. Matias's bones creaked. The wet nurse and the matron, who aided Volentia, both panicked. The women had never dreamed that they would serve a demon with their skills, and those skills were proving inadequate. The labor hadn't started. It hadn't needed to. The child had simply violently removed the barrier between it and the rest of the world. She now sat in a pool of her mother's blood, looking curiously at the intestines around her. They needed a witch. The door slammed open. There stood Varder. The accursed, thrice-chained, bellowed like the savage he was. What's wrong? He recognized what was happening. Fear stole through him. Behind him stood another man, one with a human hair dress. Hair with the heads still attached. The shaman's eyes glinted in equal fear. But Varder's fear, Matias understood. Despite their hate for each other, they both loved Volentia in similar manners. Though Varder loved her like a goddess, a knight to his lady, or a son to his mother. And Matias loved her as a man loved a woman. The shaman was different, though. His fear was unnatural. Volentia was dying, her hands weakening. The shaman pushed past Varder. Out of my way! I can save her! He growled. His hands contorted, and he gripped the air like it had substance. Volentia's hand went limp, and in that moment the shaman pulled on the air. Crimson light flowed from Volentia's mouth. The shaman held her soul in his hands, then reached for the newborn girl. Varder! He's going to kill the child! Matias called. Varder's eyes widened. He was a surprisingly clever man when it counted. Big hands reached up and wrapped around the shaman's little neck. A chirped last gasp escaped from the man before Varder slammed him into the wall. It was with such explosive violence that this occurred that Matias was shocked that the man still held Volentia's soul. Varder sank a fist into the man's stomach. Vomit burst from the shaman's mouth, and Volentia's soul snapped back into her. She gasped, and her head lulled. She felt wrong to Matias. She was still dead. He could feel nothing from her, but the void he felt in himself. She had joined him amongst the undead. The heartbeat from Varder beat so loudly it almost deafened Matias, the sheer violence of it. "It was her dream, little man," Varder whispered in his foul tongue to the shaman. "That child is her everything." The shaman's head was a lump, his body broken and shattered. He wasn't breathing, but there was still a faint heartbeat there. The man did have a vial. He could be saved. "Varder, does this man not deserve a proper execution?" Matias asked. Varder looked over angrily. "I don't see why I need to listen to you." A weak voice then came.
"He must be humbled publicly. Strick him of his rank and honors. Beat him like the bad dog he is. Make it hurt."
The demon had spoken. Varder complied.
"Matias,"
Volentia muttered.
"raise her right for me."
Volentia lay in torment. She could no longer die, but she was too weak to scream. All she could do was breathe ragged breaths and hope for oblivion. Blood healed Volentia enough for her to speak, and she constructed her own tomb. It was made in such a way to support her comfort. Within, she gained much of her original strength, but not all. They both agreed that the sight of her would terrify Visenia, to wait to bring the child to her mother. Matias was given primary control over Visenia's upbringing, much to Varder's displeasure. But Volentia insisted. Present day. Matias pulled the blade out of the Northmen's gut. "That's the last of them! Clean up, men! We have won a great victory this day!" They cheered as he retreated to his castle. The final blade stroke of the Northmen occupation. The future of his daughter was still shaky. Her blood was trying to corrupt her, but she was free now from her bad influences. As long as seeing her mother doesn't destroy her.